So Michael just talked about how our strategy is underpinned by insights. So this afternoon I'm going to share with you some very, very high-level insights, which will hopefully demonstrate to you some of our biggest opportunities. So to do that, I'll share with you a bit of an outlook on demand for red meat. We'll have a look at the key competitors, and we'll have a look at the key opportunities. Now, anyone that knows me would know that I would love to talk about this for hours and share lots of data and lots of insights, but Lisa's given me 15 minutes. So to give you a real feel for what those big opportunities are, I apologise up front that I will talk mostly about beef and sheep meat, but the opportunities are true for all of Australian red meat. So I'm going to start by talking about red meat demand, and I'm talking about global red meat demand, and we'll have a look at what it has been, what it's forecast to be, and what that means for Australian beef and for Australian sheep meat. So starting with a chart that looks a little bit complex, it's not really. Basically, it's telling you that for the last 30 years, global consumption of both beef and sheep meat has been increasing. So to give you the number over that period, so beef meat consumption has grown at around 20% over that 30 years, and for sheep meat, that's around 50%. And the good news is that consumption is forecast to continue to grow. So in the next 5 to 7 years, that growth is somewhere around 1 to 3% that most institutions are forecasting for growth. What's driving that growth? So there are many, many factors driving that growth. Michael talked about a couple, and this afternoon you're going to hear about even more in the last session. But things like population growth, and Michael talked about the middle income, and he used the example of China. That will drive growth, along with things like urbanisation, to name a few of the drivers. But unfortunately, it's not all about drivers. There are some headwinds, and headwinds that we watch. And some of those headwinds, for example, are around price, competing proteins, and lifestyle choices. So global consumption is forecast to continue to grow. It's a fairly positive outlook. Now we'll have a look at what that means for beef. So we talked about consumption growing over the last 20 years, and it's been relatively stable in some of what we call our more traditional markets like the US. But consumption has grown rapidly in regions like Asia and the Middle East. And as that consumption has been growing in those regions, not surprisingly, Australia's share of export markets has been changing. So around 20 years ago, the top two markets, Japan and US, represented around 80% of all of our beef exports. If you have a look at those two markets today, they're more like 50%. So, expecting growth across most regions. If we have a look at sheep meat, it's a very similar story. If you have a look at the green on this chart, you can see consumption in developed markets has been relatively stable, with the bulk of the growth happening in the yellow section, which is the developing markets. And that growth in consumption has predominantly been driven through Asia. So like we saw with beef, not too surprisingly, you can see Asia as a proportion of our exports has doubled in that time. Similarly, markets like the US have doubled, where sheep meat is a niche protein. So sheep meat consumption is expected from developing markets. So it's a reasonably positive outlook, with global red meat consumption forecast to increase in a changing marketplace though. So remember, we have drivers, we have headwinds, and the markets which we supply to are rapidly changing. So now we're going to have a look at beef. And I'll start by showing you Australia's place in the world. Then we'll have a look at the competition. And then we'll have a look at what that means for opportunities for Australian beef. So, may or may not be surprising to some of you, Australia is a relatively small beef producer on a global scale. We represent about 3% of total beef production. But where this changes is when we start having a look at global beef exports. So in terms of global beef exports, you can see we hold a much higher proportion, holding around 14% of global beef exports. So a small producer with a big impact in export markets. And you can see in the export markets, in terms of competitors, the three biggest are US, Brazil, and India. So bear with me on this slide. I know there's a lot of information on here in terms of bars going up and down. If we have a look at those top three competitors for beef, what we see prior to the grey box, so prior to 2017, are years where you've got some production being up or production being down. And what has changed since 2017 and unfortunately forecast to continue for the next few years is that production from these three major competitors is forecast to increase all at once. So, small producer, big on exports, and competition increasing. If we have another look at these competitors, we see a bit of a different story. So this is a chart of averages, and we all have to be careful with averages. And I'll get into a chart that's not completely averages. But if you have a look at the average global price per kilo of the four competitors, us included, you can see that 8 years ago, the gap between the lowest price per kilo and the highest price per kilo was around $2. If you have a look at today, that gap has widened and it's around $5 per kilo. So all exports are not equal. And the gap between the lowest and the highest is widening, and we need to focus on keeping ourselves at the top of that wide. So I'm now going to share a case study with you to sort of give you a feel for what does this mean. Now, I'll say up front, this is just a case study. I'm going to use China as the example market, but this is true of our global markets when we're thinking about Australian beef. So if we look at those, if we look at the competitors in terms of imports within China, thinking about beef, you can see, like we saw on the last chart, there's a wide range in price, and you can also see there's a wide range in share of the total volume in that market in terms of imports. And what's important to note is that the bulk of the volume is underpinned by low-value beef, but there's a growing segment of consumers who appreciate quality and who are willing to pay for it. So not surprisingly, I'm now going to talk to you about those consumers that are looking for quality and are willing to pay for it. So Michael referenced our global consumer tracker earlier. That's one set of data and insight that we have. We also have a specific research project that we've done in China and other markets. And this really gets us to the point of understanding who the competitor is and where they are. So bear with me some of the terminology I use here. So basically from the research, we've identified 15 cities within China that are the most attractive for short to medium term growth. And within those cities, we've found high beef spenders. They are what they sound. So these are the people that spend over the equivalent of Australian $95 per month on beef. And what we know about our high beef spenders is that they are more likely to eat meat every day. And they are also more likely to be looking for premium beef and more likely to be buying Australian beef. So increasingly, it's going to be important for us to understand the consumer who's looking for a quality product and willing to pay a premium for it. So, no surprise then, the focus for beef is on the premium growth opportunities. I'm now going to move to sheep meat and do very similar to what I just did for beef. We'll have a look at Australia's place in the world, we'll have a look at the competition, and then we'll have a look at the opportunities for Australian sheep meat. So very similar story to what we saw for beef. From a global production point of view, Australia is a relatively small producer of sheep meat. We represent about 7% of total production. What's different versus beef is that there's a very big grey called other, and a lot of the other consume what they produce. So when we have a look at the exports for sheep meat, Australia plays an even bigger role when it comes to sheep meat, representing around 40% of total sheep meat exports, and very tight competition there with New Zealand. And when we have a look at our share of exports, it's been increasing over the last 15 years. So currently around 40%, but it has grown 15% in the last 15 years. And so what we saw 15 years ago was lamb production would go down, price would go up, and vice versa. And then 10 years ago, a similar story, where lamb production would go up, price would go down. But in the last 4 years, the equation appears to have changed, where lamb production is going up in line with price. So the big question is, has the equation changed, or are we nearing a tipping point? So the most important thing that we need to do is maintain that momentum and make sure it's not a tipping point, and focus on driving that momentum. And how do we do that? Oh, simple. I better explain this chart to you. So this is from our Global Consumer Tracker, and it's telling you, this is all you need to know, it's telling you that in a market like Korea, only 25% of consumers surveyed have actually purchased sheep meat. Compared to a market like Australia, nearly 90% of consumers have purchased sheep meat. So there's a real opportunity to drive awareness of sheep meat in some of our more traditional markets. Oh, how are we going to do that? Through education. So Michael shared this chart before. And we ask consumers who haven't bought sheep meat why they haven't. And these are the main reasons that they tell us. So the good news is most of it is around not being familiar. Now we can educate on not being familiar and make it more familiar for them. And there's also a group who they don't buy it to cook at home, but they will try it in food service. So we can use food service as well to educate. But then the last piece that we have to focus on is around differentiation. So we saw on the sheep meat export chart, it's neck and neck, if you like, between Australia and New Zealand. So in those markets where we're established and they're established, we need to continue to differentiate. Similarly, in some of the growing, developing markets as well, you have a lot broader range of competitors. And having that point of difference is super important for maintaining the premium. So for sheep meat, it's all about maintaining that momentum by driving awareness through education and differentiation. So in summary, the main opportunities for Australian red meat are consumption is forecast to grow, which is good news. There are drivers and headwinds at play. For beef, it's all about focusing on the premium opportunities for growth and understanding the consumer and who that consumer is and where they are. And for Sheepmeat, it's about maintaining that momentum that we've seen in the last 4 years. To be able to do all of that, we need to keep ahead of the competition and increasingly understand all about our marketplace and our consumer and how best to target them. So I haven't talked about market access today. That's obviously a significant opportunity, but the whole next session is on market access, and you'll hear more about the protein landscape, consumer insights, and the competitive landscape in the last session. Thank you.
Well done, Nat.